You'll be forgiven if you missed it, but Peter Dutton managed to find the time to duck off for a 3-day visit to Israel last week, and the Sky News army were absolutely frothing over it.
I've got some breaking news, and that is a release has just come through that Peter Dutton is off to Israel. He's making a 3-day visit to Israel, which I think is fantastic news. He's off today.
Breaking news. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has just landed in Israel for a 3-day trip. This is a strong show of support from the coalition towards our closest ally in the Middle East.
And Peter Dutton once again is showing Australians what leadership really looks like. He's actually doing the things for Australia on the international stage, not going on some Kentucky tour on Toto One and having champagne in the White House.
I thought it was great that Pete managed to find the time for a 3-day PR blitz, given that he couldn't manage to squeeze a visit to Ghana into his schedule.
There will be no revisiting of truth-telling.
Dutton's trip was reportedly paid for by the Australian, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, essentially a lobby group. It earned him a lot of mileage on Sky, as well as a decent amount of social content.
Mr. Dutton, you've met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is a very significant meeting, the first Australian politician to meet with him since October 7. What did you discuss?
I get the impression that Dutton likes to think of himself as a hard man, so no doubt he had a hard conversation with Netanyahu about the killing of aid workers.
Well, we had about an hour meeting, which was quite lengthy, and he had his national security team there as well. So it was high level, and I was very grateful for the access and the time that he gave to us. As you know, Israel has provided intelligence to Australia over a period of time, which has resulted in the lives of Australian diggers being saved in the Middle East. And I think it's a relationship that we need to rebuild, that we need to restore, and that we need to respect.
Nah, he wouldn't have touched that, because apparently, well, according to opposition sources, the coalition don't believe the killing of an Australian aid worker even warrants a report. Peter Dutton's been quoted as saying that it was a mistake to commission the report in the first place and criticised it as a political decision. Somehow I don't think the victims' families would see it quite the same way, Pete. Here's Tony Burke giving a reasoned response to the ridiculous position taken by opposition sources.
What do you make of that suggestion by opposition sources? To me, there should never have been a Binskin report into this death.
We certainly are grateful that we got the cooperation that had been demanded by the Australian government. But I think what Penny Wong said on receipt of the report is really important, that there are obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to protect the distribution of aid and of aid workers. Plainly, that didn't happen. We condemn the strikes that caused the killing of Zoe Franklin, and the government continues to press with the Israeli ambassador and through all our representations to make sure that all appropriate responses are followed through and considered, including whether or not there should be criminal penalties.
Back to Dutton's PR blitz. In a 15-minute live cross from Israel, Dutton forgot to mention who'd organised his trip. He also forgot to mention what was happening across the border. Instead, he spent his time reminding Israel what a great friend he'd be if he was the PM.
I sent a very clear message on behalf of the coalition that should we win the next election, we look forward to the relationship becoming stronger and making sure that we can build off the platform of previous Prime Ministers where the relationship has been close, it has been strong, and to our mutual benefit.
He also took the opportunity to take a free kick at the ABC as well.
Mr. Dutton, I understand from my own contacts that Australia's anti-Israel media coverage and even the impartiality of the taxpayer-funded ABC was raised during your meeting with Netanyahu and Ron Dermer. I understand that Ron Dermer spoke about his own experience of being interviewed on the 7:30 report. He saw that as a hostile interview. Did you find it extraordinary that the taxpayer-funded ABC was called into question at the highest levels of the Israeli government?
Well, Shari, I had watched Ron's interview on the ABC. I found it quite astounding, and I think the ABC needs to have a recheck. I think Kim Williams really needs to show some backbone and stand up to people like Laura Tingle and others who have hijacked the ABC. This is taxpayers' money, and it needs to be objective in its reporting. Clearly it's not, and the inherent bias now, the cultural bias within the ABC is the reason that their numbers are plummeting, and most Australians find it a distraction from their daily lives and their own views, instead of being the informative news source that it has been for all of us over a long period of time. So I thought Ron did an exceptional job in that interview and pushing back. In fact, I'd encourage him to do more. But I think, yes, I mean, I think there's people who really have been quite amazed by some of the reporting, particularly the ABC, and that's been expressed to us by different people on this visit.
Now, I watched the interview, and you can here too. I'll leave a link in the description. Sarah Ferguson grilled Ron Dermer on the International Criminal Court prosecutor's decision to request arrest warrants for Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, along with his Defence Minister, as well as 3 leaders of Hamas.
Minister Dermer, welcome to 7:30.
Good to be with you, Sarah.
124 countries are signed up as parties to the International Criminal Court. Now, if the judges issue warrants for the arrest of Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant, the authorities in those countries would be obliged to arrest them. How could Mr. Netanyahu continue as Prime Minister in those circumstances?
Well, I don't think it's going to affect what Israelis feel about this, because they think the charges are outrageous and dangerous. They're outrageous not just because it created a false symmetry between the leaders of a terror organization, Hamas, and Israel's prime minister and defense minister, but because it's also false charges. The idea that Israel is trying to starve the population in Gaza or intentionally killing civilians in Gaza, people reject it.
The interview was prickly, as you'd expect from Sarah Ferguson, and given the subject matter. It's worth remembering that Ron Dermer is said to be a close ally of Netanyahu, and the interview came just days after the prosecutor requested arrest warrants. It's stating the obvious, but it was bound to be tense, and there'd be no prizes for guessing what the majority of the questions were going to be about. But a hostile interview? Not really. Confronting questions, yeah. But when you're talking about alleged war crimes, what would you expect? A puff piece?
Hostile interview.
Given that Peter Dutton has threatened to withdraw Australia from the ICC if he becomes Prime Minister, it's no surprise that he'd have found the questions hostile. If a current affairs program can't ask questions relating to actual current affairs without being labelled hostile, I'm not sure where that really leaves us. If the media can't report on these stories, and if they can't report on atrocities taking place, including the killing of aid workers for fear of being labelled anti-Israel or worse, anti-Semitic, where does this leave us?
Israeli forces have attacked our convoys, detained our staff, bulldozed our vehicles, hospitals have been bombed and raided, and now, for a second time, one of our staff shelters has been hit. This pattern of attacks is either intentional or indicative of reckless incompetence.
I did think there was a certain irony that came with Dutton gobbing off about bias on the ABC while fielding softball questions from Sky News.
And the inherent bias now, the cultural bias within the ABC, is the reason that their numbers are plummeting, and most Australians find it a distraction from their daily lives and their own views.
What do you think Dutton's visit was about? Was it about satisfying lobby groups? Was it trying to find a point of difference between himself and Albanese? Dutton's PR blitz was designed to sell one side of the story. He would have been hoping that it would have also helped to sell him as a strong leader. Peter Dutton's comments with respect to the Binskin report demonstrate that he's no leader. What sort of leader would not want to investigate the circumstances that led to the death of aid workers, including one of their own citizens? If Peter Dutton and the coalition are not the least bit curious how something like this could happen, then I don't believe that they're the least bit qualified to be running the country.